Oh man, coming up, the story of a song that the writer said was like putting together a really difficult jigsaw puzzle. It was very complex, and in the end, the song was over 10 minutes long, and it had so many layers to it, and lyrical twists and turns, it was like a foreign film. Problem is, this was in a time where radio wouldn't play songs over 4 minutes long, so the band had to figure out how to trim it down. This meant leaving 2 whole verses on the cutting room floor. The song became an instant classic and the de facto hit of one of the most famous years in music history. Back when Paul McCartney first heard it, he freaked out. It didn't sound like anything on radio, but would anyone ever hear the full song? Also, could anyone solve or decode the cryptic song? After it went to the top of the charts the world over, on its way to selling 10 million copies, the band behind it fractured like a week later. Would they ever have another hit? The story of a song coming up next that every legend wished they'd written. At least a lot of them have said that on Professor of Rock. Hey music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you've ever saved a cassette tape, or several tapes for that matter, from being eaten by your boombox with the mighty pen or pencil, this channel is just for you. Make sure that you subscribe below right now. Click the notification button so that you never miss out. We have some really big interviews coming this year, even the next few months. We also have a Patreon that you're going to want to check out. We just put up a 15-minute video with a lot of different interview clips in there that you can only see there. And we have a new series starting there as well. You can check that out in the description. So it's high time for another edition of our series, The New Standards. This is a show that takes an in-depth look into songs that transcend genre, decade, and fads for that matter. You know, there's songs that are musical monuments in our culture and our society. On previous episodes, we've covered Hey Jude by the Beatles.
Hey Jude, don't make it bad.
Hotel California by the Eagles.
Plenty of room at the Hotel California.
And Dreams by Fleetwood Mac. But today, we're taking a deep dive into the mysterious and the masterful A Wider Shade of Pale by Procol Harum. So our story begins on May 17th, 1967. Paul McCartney was out on the town in London. That night, he met a 25-year-old freelance photographer named Linda. Future Mrs. McCartney, of course. But the evening was memorable for another reason as well. While frequenting a nightclub called the Speakeasy, Paul, Linda, and a group of friends discovered the debut single of a new local band. Said McCartney, it was the first evening any of us had ever heard a record called A Wider Shade of Pale, with words about feeling seasick.
I was feeling kind of seasick.
The lyrics were all very strange and poetic, and the theme was a famous Bach theme, but we didn't know that. We just thought, what an incredible record. And we were all trying to guess who it was. So we had to go to the booth and ask, what was that one you just played? And he said, oh yes, Wider Shade of Pale by Procol Harum. Procol what? Is that Latin or something? That's what he said. Sure, Sir Paul must have had a similar reaction to many of us who heard this enigmatic tune for the very first time. It's like falling under a spell. It's musical sorcery, really. It's all you can think of, and you only want to get more of it.
We skip the light fandango.
So who were these guys that seemed to come out of nowhere? Well, let's turn back the clock and get a sense of what led up to A Wider Shade of Pale. Before fronting Procol Harum, Gary Brooker played piano for a band called the Paramounts, who mostly played cover versions of American R&B songs. But he was unable to gain much traction, and the group split in 1966. That same year, Gary Brooker was introduced to the whimsical wordsmith Keith Reid by record producer Guy Stevens. Reid's odd lyrics appealed to Brooker, and the two teamed up as a songwriting duo.
Was humming harder.
Said Brooker, when I met Keith, seeing his words, I thought I'd like to write something just like that. They weren't obvious. That doesn't matter. You don't have to know what he means as long as you communicate an atmosphere. Now, after struggling to find artists to record their songs, the two just decided to form their own band. That was in 1967. The mysteriously named Procol Harum, though Reid's role would be solely lyrical. He was an official and vital part of the band. Brooker took on vocal duties and the keyboard, and after putting an ad in the Melody Maker, they enlisted guitarist Ray Royer, bassist David Knights, multi-instrumentalist Matthew Fisher, and then drummer Bobby Harrison. A lot of bands met through Melody Maker. Procol Harum recorded A Wider Shade of Pale in 1967 at Olympic Sound Studios in London with the help of manager and producer Danny Cordell. From what this hastily thrown together group had written up to that point, this is the best song they'd come up with. Cordell had booked a 3-hour recording session, and A Wider Shade of Pale was recorded pretty quickly. 2 takes were enough. You can imagine that.
We call out for love dream.
For these cuts, they used session drummer Bill Iden, since Bobby Harrison needed to rehearse more before recording. Then some days later, they asked Cordell if they could go back into the studio and to re-record the song, this time with the help of Harrison. And Cordell agreed, which is pretty rare. A Wider Shade of Pale is a complex song, both musically and lyrically. And we're going to dive into that. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear, the glasses that I wear every single day. Zenni has styles for every budget. You can get a pair for $6.95 or can upgrade all the way up to $30. You choose the style, the shape, the color, and you add features that you like. You can get a fully loaded pair of frames for less than a vinyl record. Check it out today at zenni.com. The combination of its solemn organ melody and dreamlike lyrics leave a lasting, wonder-filled imprint upon your mind. Musically, the song's main chord progression and melody are adapted from Johann Sebastian Bach's Suite No. 3 in D major, otherwise known as Air on A-G string. Brooker added Bach's Suite to what Reid called a lot of abstract phrases. Of course, his lyrics have been the cause for a lot of analysis and speculation over the years. Some have tied it to the growing hippie scene in 1967 Summer of Love, describing it as the greatest acid lyric ever written. However, Reid has debunked this view many times, stating that he didn't take acid when he wrote the song. So the search for the song's meaning actually begins elsewhere, more specifically at a party that Reid attended. While he was there, Reid's friend, producer Guy Stevens, turned to his wife at one point and remarked, "You've just turned a wider shade of pale." The comment, it intrigued Reid and it really stuck with him from that point forward.
Turn the wider shade of pale.
It soon served as the launching off point for one of history's most endearing songs. Additionally, other bizarre and fantastic images would continue to follow. Skipping the Light Fandango.
Skip the light fandango.
Favorite lyric from the song. 16 Vestal Virgins.
One of 16 Vestal virgins.
Telling Miller.
As the miller told his tale.
Ceiling That Flew Away.
As the ceiling flew away.
Their tantalizing obscurity has riveted the public's attention for decades. Though neither Reid nor Brooker have fully explained what these words and images mean, they've left us with some breadcrumbs to follow along the way. For instance, Reid said that he intended the lyrics to be more evocative than literal, and that he was striving to fashion the lyrics into a cinematic experience for our minds, cinema of the mind. For him, this was a natural extension of his influences at the time, primarily French cinema and surrealist painters like René Magritte and Salvador Dali. Now, I'm not an art critic, of course, but for the context of this song, it's kind of important to have a basic idea of what surrealism is. It's a style of art that delves deep into the subconscious mind, often focusing on the irrational. The resulting images are often dreamlike, bizarre, and when juxtaposed together may seem incongruent or incompatible even. The lyrics of A Wider Shade of Pale and the images they create in our minds are clearly penned with a surrealist touch. This is why their meaning can seem so elusive. A dream can only be properly understood when you're dreaming. But if the images appear cryptic and nonlinear, the narrative itself really is a straightforward journey, more than just a cluster of lines stuck together. Reid has said that within the song there are characters, a location, and a journey. In other words, there is a story playing out. It just happens to be couched in dreamlike imagery. Now, Gary Brooker threw some light on the storyline when he described A Whiter Shade of Pale as being about two people in the memory of a relationship. It's a sad girl leaves boy kind of story. He said, to get the soul of those lyrics across vocally, to make people feel that, it's quite an accomplishment. I remember the day it arrived, 4 very long stanzas. I thought, here's something. I happened to be at the piano when I read them, already playing a musical idea. It fit the lyrics within a couple of hours. You might have noticed that Brooker mentioned 4 very long stanzas, as I described just now. When Reid originally conceived the song, it was twice as long as it would become. 2 of those original 4 verses would be cut in the recording process. But apparently, Reid had initially envisioned, a Dylan-esque, Beatles epic scope for the song, like Dylan did so many times, like with Rolling Stone.
Like a rolling stone.
Of course, the Beatles later did it with Hey Jude. As they prepared to record, one of the verses just fell away pretty naturally, I guess. According to Matthew Fisher, it was obvious that it wasn't as good as the others, and the band was starting to feel like maybe 10 minutes was a little too long for a pop song. The process of cutting repeated itself when Procol Harum's producer Denny Cordell advised him that a 7-minute song wouldn't get any airplay. Of course, I just said, Hey Jude. Beatles proved that wrong a few years later, or a year later. But even with the song cut in half, Reid's lyrics were strong enough to capture the ears of listeners for generations to come. From the outset of the song, it seems like the singer and his girl are at a party, perhaps a nod to the party that inspired the title of the song.
Turns cartwheels across the floor.
As you move through the story, you realize that the narrator is losing his partner. And while the scenario plays out, everything around them is going topsy-turvy, as Paul McCartney would say. This may be tied to the drunken implication of the lyrics.
The room was humming harder.
But I think there's more depth to it than that. From a surrealist perspective, the incongruent imagery could very well be symbolic of how the narrator is feeling inside as the moment of their breakup closes in. We've all been there.
And the truth is plain to see.
And there is this moment. Her face turns a whiter shade of pale.
The whiter shade of pale.
So what are we to make of the song's chorus entitled Anyway? Why does her face turn pale? If we fall back to a literal interpretation, maybe she's experiencing some intense emotional distress. Maybe all the blood has drained from her face. Some have suggested that the line, as the miller told his tale,
As the mirror told his tale.
that's a reference to the Miller's Tale from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Perhaps mention of the vulgar story implies that the narrator has made some sort of lewd comment or joke that has turned her face pale. However, Reid has gone on record saying that he never read the Miller's Tale before writing these lyrics. It certainly wasn't a conscious idea for me to quote from Chaucer, no way. If instead we approach the line with a little more imagination, maybe we can find some symbolism there. A whiter shade of pale could represent how she changed now that they're no longer together. Maybe your face has become ghostly white and translucent because the memory of who she once was to him is dying right before his eyes. Maybe, I don't know. But what I do know is that no song has to be bound to a single interpretation. Each of us comes to every lyric, every song, every album from our own personal experience. What I bring to the music is definitely going to differ from what you bring, and that's what makes music great. In a lot of interviews I've done, so many artists take a vow of silence when it comes to interpreting their music. At least that's what they say. They don't want to pigeonhole their art too much. I think that's a better way anyway, really. With that in mind, I'd love to hear what these lyrics mean to you. What your memories are. So share that in the comments and we'll have a nice discussion. A Wider Shade of Pale really struck a chord with the listeners across the world in 1967. It took a mere 3 weeks to reach #1 in the UK, and it stayed there for a total of 6 weeks. It would go on to become one of the biggest selling singles of all time, chalking up over 10 million copies sold. The song would do incredibly well internationally as well. It climbed to the top of the charts in, I think, 15 different countries and across the Atlantic as well. Here in the States, A Wider Shade of Pale reached #5 on the Billboard Hot 100. This despite receiving only limited promotion in the US. It should have been a #1 hit, and probably really was.
You said there is no reason.
However, the Procol Harum that recorded A Wider Shade of Pale ceased to exist almost as soon as the song was released, in no small part due to how quickly it became a hit. With commercial good fortunes come all the trappings of music industry fame as we know. Shows, interviews, photo shoots, radio sessions filled up the band's itinerary. Stress and pressure started to mount. Internal difficulties were also rife within the band, which had been put together quite quickly, quite hastily. Everything was happening at a pace that was just too fast for Procol Harum. Just 3 weeks after A Wider Shade of Pale clinched the top spot in the UK, all of the band's British dates were suddenly canceled. The reason put forth was that the band members were just mentally fatigued and physically exhausted. A press release stated that the band had been examined by a doctor and advised to take immediate rest. But there was more to it than that. We know years later that there was something else there. According to Matthew Fisher, putting on the brakes was actually Denny Cordell's idea, the producer. Said Fisher, he pulled us off the road because he felt that we were playing too many gigs for too little money, and he wanted to put us in the studio. When the group did return to the studio to record an album and a follow-up single, expectations, of course, had skyrocketed. And their output during these sessions left, let's just say, something to be desired. Procol Harum was stuck in a jam at the height of their success. What might have been the greatest moment of their lives was becoming a nightmare, and that happens far too often in this industry. As a result, Brooker and Reid cut ties with their original drummer, Bobby Harrison, and guitarist Ray Royer. They were replaced by Barry Wilson on drums and Robin Trower on guitar. Both had more experience. Although the band's follow-up single Hamburg scored a #6 ranking in the UK,
For the floor she found descended.
neither it nor Procol Harum would rise again to the lofty heights of A Wider Shade of Pale. How could you? Write a masterpiece your first time out. However, Procol Harum were quite prolific throughout the remainder of the 60s and the 70s. They released albums on almost a yearly basis. But by the mid-70s, with the UK in the throes of punk rock, Procol Harum's progressive rock stylings started to sound dated to many listeners. The band broke up in 1977 after their album Something Magic stalled at number 147 on the top albums chart.
Wizard man's got a pocket full of lead.
After a stint as a keyboardist in Eric Clapton's band, Brooker reformed Procol Harum in 1991 with Fisher, Trower, and Reid. Their album, The Prodigal Stranger, met with modest success, but from the beginning, Procol Harum had always been more concerned with the quality and the integrity of their music than with scoring a chart-topping hit or a pop ditty.
We're young, we're brave.
They were measuring their legacy by a higher standard. As for A Wider Shade of Pale, it's become a familiar staple in pop culture since its inauguration. For instance, it's been featured in a lengthy list of films and TV shows, much more than we have the time to highlight here. Here's a small sampling starting in the 80s. It was Laverne and Shirley. It was in that in 82.
We're gonna do it. Give us any chance, we'll take it.
It was in The Big Chill in 83. That was a big moment.
The Big Chill, a Lawrence Kasdan film, in theaters November 6th.
Falcon and the Snowman in 85.
Timothy Hutton, Sean Penn, a John Schlesinger film, The Falcon and the Snowman.
China Beach in 89. Third Rock from the Sun in 96 and 2001. Gilmore Girls in 2006. Cold Case. House.
Seasick,
90210, Parenthood, Oblivion. iZombie, and Morning Joe. And there's an even longer list of musicians who have covered the song. Over 1,000 people have covered this song. The Everly Brothers did it in '67. Johnny Rivers did it in '68. Joe Cocker in '78.
There isn't no reason.
Bonnie Tyler in '81. Willie Nelson. Annie Lennox. Michael Bolton. Sarah Brightman. And Santana featuring Steve Winwood in 2021. Also Eric Clapton. Queen. Dave Matthews.
Flew away.
And Billy Joel. One of my favorites is HSAS. Hagar and Neil Schon together. And you know, with the recent passing of the legendary Gary Brooker, you can bet that there's going to be even more artists that pay tribute that you can just add to this list. Again, I just covered a few. Over 1,000 people, like I said, have covered this. This song just has serious staying power. That's why it's an all-time standard. Sadly, as I just mentioned, the legendary singer Gary Brooker passed away on February 19th, 2022. The man who wrote and sang for Eric Clapton's band and with Bill Wyman's Rhythm Kings, who toured with Ringo's All-Stars and contributed to solo projects for Paul McCartney, for George Harrison. He's moved on to rock and roll heaven, the next chapter in his rock and roll story. He was a singer, a pianist, a composer, and of course, an instrumental force in bringing us the peculiar delight that is A Wider Shade of Pale.
Turn the wider shade of pale.
Brooker was 76 years old and he died peacefully at home. My dad loved this song. That's how I first heard it, of course. He handed it down to me. He told me about its influence on he and his friends as he was in high school. And my dad always told me, even with Bob Dylan and the Beatles and the Stones and the Beach Boys all reaching their creative zeniths in 65 and 66 into 67, The Summer of Love really belonged to Gary Brooker and Procol Harum due to A Wider Shade of Pale. The song that seemed to give spiritual enlightenment to a generation of disaffected hippies, who longed to skip the light fandango and turn cartwheels across the floor.
Turns cartwheels across the floor.
Leave us a comment about Procol Harum and A Wider Shade of Pale. What are your memories of this song? Let us know in the comments below. And if you dig our content, make sure that you subscribe below so you never miss out on our videos. We would love to have you as part of our community. Here's a tribute to Gary Brooker. That's what we're going to end on. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.